what's the difference between watercolor and watercolor pencils? I'm gonna look into that and show you how they compare side by side on a landscape painting. It's pretty obvious both watercolor and watercolor pencils differ in the way they look like. On the one hand, there's traditional watercolor that most people will use within tubes or pans or half pans. Then the watercolor pencils come in the form of a colored pencil that is water soluble. In terms of quality for one or the other, I'd say it depends on the brand according to what I've witnessed. So there are watercolors that are very low quality, not that pigmented, chalky for example, while others are of extra fine artist quality with vibrant colors that look beautiful and are easy to layer. And watercolor pencils are no different. They come with various pigmentation formulas. The leads will be more or less sturdy and they'll feel more or less easy to color with. There is such a wide variety of brands and lines within each brand that it would not be fair to say that watercolors are better than watercolor pencils. There's just a lot more choice, but overall prices often reflect the quality. At first glance, I think it's obvious there would be more control with watercolor pencil than there would with watercolor because we get the precision from the lead here. But at the same time, these pencils can feel restrictive to paint a full artwork, and I'll prove that it's not the case, by the way. In contrast, with watercolor, there's choice between various paintbrushes, so it can feel like more is achievable. Supplies are pretty similar for both mediums. For example, you can use the same watercolor paper. Today, I'll actually use the Arches Cold Press 100% cotton paper for both. Watercolor pencil does need less water than watercolor, so there's more flexibility with papers there. As long as the one you're using is thick enough, it will handle light washes of paint. Then I do find that in terms of paper texture, watercolor is more flexible and will go great on all watercolor paper texture types, smooth, slightly grainy, and rough, while a rough texture would make it harder to color with watercolor pencils. Watercolor pencils do better on smooth to slightly grainy papers, and I'll link this video I made about paper for watercolor pencils in the description for more information about that. For the rest of the supplies, I've been using the exact same paintbrushes for both. And I like extra sheets of watercolor paper for my watercolor pencils. That would be the only thing extra with a pencil sharpener, and I'll show you why next. I do find you only need 1 jar of water with watercolor pencils, when with watercolor, it's helpful to have 2, and that's because we tend to use more water with watercolor and dirty the water more. But overall, supplies are pretty similar, if not exactly the same, and it might be easier to carry watercolor pencils around when you're on the go, but even watercolor is nice for that. Now let's see how they do side by side in a landscape painting. This experiment might vary a bit with the subject. Keep it in mind for your own practice, but a landscape like this one will give you a very good idea of how they compare, since here we do have a smooth sky and water effect to paint, as well as some detail. So it'll be interesting to see if we can get a similar effect with both watercolor and watercolor pencils. In watercolor, I know I can add the mountains and the rocks from my reference without drawing, so it's just going to be a line. It's common practice to approach watercolor that way. And with watercolor pencils, I could sketch out some of these if I wanted to. They make it easy because a huge difference with watercolor, despite the precision, is that you can use them dry and then activate the pigment right on paper. As a beginner, I would have used them to draw right away, but because I know them well now, I choose not to do that yet, since most of the painting will be a smooth background. I don't want to have to outline the shapes while trying to paint the background, and I'll show you how I color with watercolor pencils in a minute. In terms of the choice and variety of colors, it's the same whether you work with watercolors and watercolor pencils. It depends on your set and on your ability to mix colors together. You can mix colors easily with both mediums, and with watercolor pencils, you can do it from a scrap piece of paper, when with watercolors, you would want to mix your paints on the palette. My art philosophy paints I'm using now leave me with less choice in colors than the Faber-Castell Arbustor box of 60 watercolor pencils that I have, so I go from there. and I matched the watercolor pencils to my paints so we can compare both paintings as much as possible. I split one same reference photo I got from Unsplash. I divided it in half, so I'm painting the left side with watercolors and the right side with watercolor pencils, and we'll get a finished painting at the end that is similar but not exactly the same. Here's a first very important point about watercolor versus watercolor pencils. There are times with watercolor pencils where you could, if you want to, sketch and color the entire reference from the get-go. I've done it before on other videos. You get to see the finished drawing before activating the pigment, and it can be pretty cool with some subjects. While with watercolor, it's more of a spontaneous process where you just learn to paint from background to middle ground to foreground and narrowing the painting down to the details as you go. There's no painting on sections of the paper this early in the process with watercolor, unless that's your way of using them. I'm really going from the global way watercolors are used here. Nothing I say is set in stone. That's why here I have mixed my colors, wet the sheet, and I'm painting a light wash with those colors. I can feel I have time to work nicely without paints drying fast because of my great paper and how long I took the time to wet it. I can also see all colors intermixing right on paper in a seamless, super smooth way. I want to take advantage of the paper being wet to add a blurry mountain that will make us feel like it's located far back in the horizon. Now on to watercolor pencils. The twist not many people seem to realize at first is that with watercolor pencils, there are many techniques you can leverage to get the looks and efficiency of watercolors. And because I want a super smooth background, rather than coloring it all and having lines show through, I use a scrap piece of paper as a color palette to go get pigment right from there and avoid the long and tedious coloring of the entire background. It doesn't take me much longer than mixing my watercolor paints. The downside of it though is you'll need to sharpen a pencil often when using this method, and it's smart to have enough paper around as well. So now I tend to use papers that I don't like for my usual watercolor works. I only use this for backgrounds, so it's not too bad unless I was to paint landscapes every day. Another advantage is I know I'll get a smooth watercolor-like background, and that's exactly why I use my watercolor pencils in this way with this particular painting. With that method, I find colors do mix as well with both mediums, and for testing this out before, I barely see any difference between the two, except you won't be wasting scrap paper pieces with watercolor. Another small difference is the fact the watercolor pencil pigments move less easily because if I add a lot of water, the colors will be too light. So with watercolor pencils, I find it a tad harder to get the vibrancy I want from a first layer. Both watercolors and watercolor pencils I'm using are suitable for artists, so I don't think it's a quantity thing. It's just easier to mix a large amount of paint from watercolors than it is from watercolor pencils, but you'll see it's not true for everything. Watercolor pencils can also feel slightly chalky compared to watercolors. They all feel this way to me, so there must be something about them, but that doesn't harm the process or the results that I'm getting. I love great depth in my painting, so I'm choosing to layer a second coat for this background, mainly to add more shadows and bring more vibrancy. Also add some details on wet paper, like tiny clouds. I noticed both mediums layer very well with the wet and wet method, and while I'm seeing the same small issues with watercolor pencils, the ones that I described before, overall you can see both mediums compare. With watercolor, to draw the main features, the mountains, the rocks, I go straight in with my paintbrush of choice. I tend to add more pigment to my mixes to make the paint a bit less transparent and build up contrast and depth. We tend to forget with experience, but drawing shapes right away can feel daunting with watercolors because it can feel like things move too fast and we only have one shot. It's not necessarily true when you master the medium and the water to paint ratio. But I remember at first, it's a skill to work on and one of those things that sets watercolor apart from everything else. I take advantage the brown paint is still wet to add color inside, blue and pink. With watercolor pencils, I literally color, and nowadays I use the coloring method to fill out a shape, like an apple or this ladybug for my Skillshare classes here. And I'll add the link in the description if you want to try these out. Or I color on a landscape piece of art. Just take care of small things like these mountains and rocks. Small things that don't need to be smooth and that require a certain level of precision. I overlap colors onto each other directly before activating, while with watercolor, I was adding more colors on wet paint. You can see already the shapes and the shadows with the coloring, which is great for people who need that comfort to see where the art is going. I also love the texture that comes through with watercolor pencils. Watercolor is also beautiful, but watercolor pencils have a more rustic charm you can't beat. Also, more pigment to play with. It's easier to make it opaque on such small areas if there's enough pigment there. While with watercolor, you need to remix or add another layer. So as you can see on large washes of paint, it can be difficult to get a lot of pigment from the watercolor pencils, but for small areas where you can color directly, it's easy to build that opacity. Something worth mentioning is you can lift color when the paint is wet or even already dry, both on watercolor and watercolor pencils in my experience. And of course, again, it depends on the brand, but generally you can lift paint on both. Overall, watercolor is more translucent at this stage, while watercolor pencils look like pencils with their more opaque, colorful, and textured look. Adding more shadows with watercolor is pretty straightforward. Just add more pigment to your mixes, and it really makes an instant difference. But again, it's common to do it without a sketch. And that can feel uncomfortable when you're not familiar with watercolor. I like to pull some of that paint onto the rest of the rocks to create texture. It's especially good when the brush is on the drier side, as it creates a slight texture. With the watercolor pencils, I decided to add pink to my mountains because blue was overpowering the mix too much. And in that sense, it might be easier to correct the color mix with watercolor before applying the paint to paper, because you see what it looks like from mixing it on the palette. While with watercolor pencils, you find out when it's time to paint, even though, as you can see, I can fix this by just layering more pencil on top and blending again later, so it's not a huge issue. I'm using the same principle to make shadows darker in the rocks. I just color more with my desired colors, and the paper takes layering several times really well. It might not work with all brands and papers, but with watercolor, we can also run into this type of problem. I can't help but notice how my browns look so much prettier in the watercolor pencil version. There's more of an orange tone in there, and that's just because I picked that pencil. I could have also picked watercolors or mixed watercolors together that would have rendered that same tone. But the fact it's so easy to add lots of pigment in one spot with the watercolor pencils make the blending look quite opaque and the rocks pop out a bit more. You can also lift easily or just add more water, so the opacity is not a cons of watercolor pencils, just a nice capability I like to leverage. With watercolor, I could achieve anything more vibrant and opaque with a bit more layering too, but it might just take more steps to get to this level of opacity. And you can see here again how watercolor pencils works well with water, but it also works well without much water at all. While with watercolor, you'll always need a certain amount to make the act of painting or layering easy. I also love I can use all that extra pigment from the watercolor pencils to pull paint onto other parts where I didn't color at all. It's doable with watercolor, but it's more subtle, I find. Keep in mind here, I don't have very fine details to add, but in the case of fine lines like eyelashes, for example, or just fine lines, watercolor pencils would be great, even if you don't own a fine paintbrush. I want to add a few highlights, and I like to use white gouache or white watercolor with watercolor. With added water, the highlights can look more or less translucent and give a magical feel, and I love that soft looks of watercolor. With watercolor pencils, I feel like the painting looks more colorful, features are more easily pronounced, it's a bit of a rustic feel like I was saying, even the highlights can be easily sharp. I dip the white pencil in water, It softens the lead and dilutes just enough of the pigment that I get a bright highlight and some texture as a bonus. Bottom line is both mediums are different, but there is some overlap with the techniques and looks you'll be getting. But then it comes down to your ability to work with each one of them, to practice and get to know each one. My belief is you can do almost anything with any medium once you know how to navigate it well. Watercolor might be better for those who are in love with letting go and creating abstract effects, while watercolor pencils might be better for perfectionists who enjoy more control, that's why I love them, and those transitioning from colored pencils to watercolor. I hope you enjoyed this video. There'll be a ton more about watercolor pencils in this playlist, and also a ton about watercolor on my channel in general. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.